So we've been talking about skepticism up to this point through the lens of Descartes and this particularly Cartesian idea of skepticism, which Descartes was, of course, concerned to show not to be correct. We also want to keep in mind some alternative forms of skepticism, claims about the lack of knowledge, claims to the effect that we lack knowledge in areas that we take ourselves to have knowledge. And in particular, it's worth noting the skepticism of the philosopher David Hume, which is skepticism about induction, connected with what's known as the problem of induction. So what is this problem? So, at the outset, some time ago, in talking about different kinds of arguments, we mentioned induction as an alternative to deduction and mentioned enumerative induction as a particular kind of inductive argument. So we might observe that a particular kind of animal had a certain colored plumage. Swans, for example. You might observe a swan, one swan, and see that it's white, another swan, and see that it's white, and so on. Many, many swans. Perhaps 1,000,000 swans or 1,000 swans, some number. And conclude on that basis with some confidence that all swans are white. We might be wrong about that. It might turn out that there are swans which are not white. It turned out, in fact, there are swans that are not white. They don't live in North America. We can find them in Australia. So it turned out that that argument, though it was quite promising on the face of it, didn't actually tell us something that was true. Nonetheless, this form of reasoning, which argues from instances of a phenomenon to a general conclusion about that phenomenon, is widely used in science and everyday life. We rely upon it, it would seem, pretty heavily, all over the place. Give another example of this sort of thing. Induction is sometimes used to make predictions about the future, as it's sometimes said, projecting the future. So we might notice, for example, that the sun rose in the morning on a given day. We might recall that the same thing happened the day before that, and the day before that. There's a sort of pattern. If we go back in history, each day we find that the sun rose. We might reasonably conclude from this, again, using the same sort of logic, that the future will contain an event of the same sort. That is, history tells us what the future will be like. It will tell us that the sun will rise on successive mornings. And once again, this may not be right. It may not be the case that the sun rises tomorrow. Perhaps there'll be some cataclysmic celestial event. Perhaps the sun will explode while we're sleeping, and the sun doesn't actually rise in the morning. It blows up, and there is no rising of the sun tomorrow. Not a terribly likely occurrence, but not out of the realm of possibility, either logical or physical. So, just as in the case of the swans, we could argue to the general conclusion that all swans are white. We could project our observations from the past into the future and say in the future that the sun will rise. This all seems very commonsensical, and indeed it is commonsensical. Again, it's something that we rely upon all the time in our everyday lives as well as in science. Hume's contribution to this consists in pointing out that it's very difficult, when you get down to it, to justify our confidence in these kinds of inferences. It's very difficult, indeed perhaps impossible, to rationally justify our faith in inductive reasoning. So Hume offered the following argument. He noted that every inductive argument of the enumerative form or the projective form any of these forms, effectively presupposes that the future will resemble the past. We call this the principle of FRP, the principle that the future will resemble the past. So if the presupposition in question is not rationally justified, if we have no good reasons for thinking that the future will resemble the past, then induction isn't justified either. The only way induction can be justified is if FRP is justified. And the problem is that this presupposition does not appear to be rationally justifiable. The conclusion is that a reliance upon induction as a guide to the world is not rationally justified, which is terribly, terribly surprising. Let's try to see in a little bit more detail what Hume is suggesting here. And to do this, we can go back to the case of the sunrise. So as we saw before, the argument proceeds from observations, historical observations about the world. The sun rose this morning, the sun rose yesterday morning, the sun rose the morning before yesterday, etc., etc. Back and back and back and back on each day in the past. Conclusion, the sun will rise tomorrow. But where does that conclusion actually come from? What underpins that inference? When we think about it, though this isn't immediately obvious, the only way we can arrive at the conclusion that the sun will rise tomorrow on the basis of these observations about the past, that is, the only way we can arrive at a conclusion about the future, is on the basis of the assumption that the future will be like the past. If we couldn't rely upon that assumption, we'd have no basis for thinking about the future that the sun will rise at that time. So inductive arguments implicitly presuppose this idea of the future resembling the past. So again, we need this assumption of the futures resembling the past in order to make these arguments go, in order to make them run. And the trouble is that it's hard to say how to justify those implicit assumptions or presuppositions. As Hume puts it, or in roughly Humean language, in order for belief in the principle that the future will resemble the past to be rationally justified, at least one of the following things would have to be true. Well, either one, the principle is self-evident, that's a truth of logic, say. It's a truth of the sort that we find, for example, in Leibniz's law, that says that if S1 and S2 are identical, then they have all the same properties. That's a possibility. Another possibility is that FRP is the conclusion of a sound deductive argument. An argument with some premises in it, where the conclusion is FRP, and the conclusion is arrived at on the basis of a valid inference from those premises, and those premises are true. The third possibility is that FRP is the conclusion of a strong inductive argument. And the difficulty here, as Hume points out, is that none of these possibilities seem to be very likely at all. None of these is even remotely plausible. The principle that the future will resemble the past does not appear to be self-evident. It does not appear to be anything like a logical truth. It's not something that comes to us from logic. It's a claim about the way the world is. It's not a claim about the way logic represents the structure of the world. It might be used to represent the structure of the world. It's nothing you could arrive at as the result of a deductive argument either. At least no one has any idea about what that argument would look like. And similarly, no one has any idea about what an argument of an inductive kind would look like that could deliver FRP as the conclusion. FRP as the conclusion. The reason for that, of course, is that inductive arguments rest upon the assumption that FRP is true. The whole basis of induction, as Hume points out, is this assumption that we're trying to justify. So we're not going to be able to use induction to justify it. If we were to do that, we'd be effectively reasoning in a circle. We don't want to do that. The conclusion is this rather unsettling point that belief in this presupposition of inductive reasoning is not rationally justified. Again, very important to keep in mind, in case one is led astray here by the situation. Very important to keep in mind what would not be a good way of arguing for FRP. And this is just to restate the point about induction. We would certainly not want to try to establish FRP by arguing as follows. Premise, the future has resembled the past. In the past, that's been the case. In the past, the future has resembled the past. Therefore, the same will be true in the future. In the future will resemble the past. This will continue. The problem here, in case it's not obvious, is that the reasoning here is perfectly circular. The reasoning presupposes that the principle that the future resembles the past is correct. But we can't assume that. The whole point of arguing for FRP is that we can find some independent basis for grounding our belief in FRP. And so an argument which presupposes that FRP is true will be useless for this purpose. This unsettling conclusion here is a little bit like the unsettling conclusion of Descartes' thought experiment in the Meditations. Descartes offered us a reason, or reasons for thinking we could overcome it. Those may or may not be successful. And what Hume's doing is something quite parallel to that. He's challenging us to provide reasons, good reasons, to believe in induction. And that turns out to be a very, very difficult project indeed. A very, very difficult challenge to meet.